Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, my name is Malheur. I'm the president and co-founder of the Center for Self-Governance, and I am P-R-O-R-E-S-P-O-N-S-I-B-L-E-G-O-V-E-R-N-M-E-N-T. I just want to make sure that the media gets that spelled correctly. I'll repeat that for them if they need me to repeat that. P-R-O, responsible, government. I'm also pro-Native Indian. But here's what I am anti. I am anti-label lynching. Labeling somebody a domestic terrorist on the verge of committing an act of domestic terrorism without due process is wrong. It just is. And so I want to tell you a little story. There's a guy named Bundy. He was imprisoned for 700 days without being convicted. Tortured in solitary confinement cell for 13 hours in his underwear. His shoulder began to dislocate. But he was never convicted. Matter of fact, in Oregon, by a jury of his peers, he was found
not guilty.
But was that reported?
No.
With adequacy? No, it wasn't. Why? Because there's a narrative at play. There's a game at play. What's the game? The game is you have to silence somebody with a label. You lynch their business. You lynch their reputation. You lynch them into prison, and then eventually what do? You kill them. How do you do that? First, it starts with sticks and stones may break my bones, but labels can get my reputation and my business destroyed. Imprisoned for 700 days without conviction as a domestic terrorist. And ultimately, like Lavoy Finicum, killed. Now, I read an article last night from media, I think? I'm not sure. But it was an article that said that the militant Lavoy Finicum. Has anybody in the media watched any of his YouTube videos? Have you paid attention to any? Have you paid attention to any of the interviews that he gave, where he said, when your rights are being violated, you should kindly and as gently as possible make your voice heard. And he repeated over and over again, we don't point guns at people. Lavoy Finicum was labeled by over 40 different mainstream media sources in the United States as a domestic extremist on the verge of committing an act of domestic terrorism, a nativist, nationalist, neo-Nazi, fascist, anti-government, reject federal authority. You mean to keep going? The media uses what's called a style guide. And the style guide is what they base all of their definitions of domestic extremism on. Well, it's funny because that style guide matches the domestic extremism lexicon of the Department of Homeland Security. I just find it interesting that we can't have civil debate in this country anymore because the mainstream media that's supposed to report the truth without their bias. That we could have a civil discourse that actually, you know what, I am P-R-O-G-O-V-E-R-N-M-E-N-T. But no, the articles that will come out tomorrow from this table will still use the phrase domestic extremism, domestic terrorist, anti-government, anti-everything. Matter of fact, that same article says that you are the biggest threat to non-whites. When in fact, that is so far from Lavoy Finicum's intention. When he gave an interview to a young Muslim lady in which he says, the Muslims' rights are being violated, I'll stand with them. Matter of fact, they should kindly and as gently as possible make their voices heard. But when are you in the media? As well as the 99% of the American people who don't have the time because they are so overwhelmed with having to produce in this country. They don't know the story of Lavoy Finicum. They just know what the media told them. So that's the purpose of this documentary that we did. We teach applied civics. We realize there's a big problem in our country. The narrative is out of control. The social justice warriors in their Marvel comic book fantasy believe that hidden under the cloak of their black robes and ski masks, that somehow they're related to Spider-Man and Superman. And I don't say that jokingly. I think in their hearts they believe the social justice movement. You are the villains in their minds. And so the job of this kind of convention, and I was hoping for the media, that their job would be, where is the dysfunction and can we resolve it? Are you interested at all in knowing the truth, media? Are you interested at all in hearing the truth of a man who was killed because he was labeled a domestic extremist on the verge of committing an act of domestic terrorism, blah, blah, blah? Are you just here for your picture of Am and Bundy so that you can have your talking points, so you can get the Montana Human Rights Organization with their 13-page document that just goes through a total litany of how all of you are the biggest domestic terrorist threat we face at the moment? I've known Jeanette Finicum since right after her husband's death, and I gotta tell you, after the FBI followed her to events like this and asked to be deputized by the sheriff of the county, and I'm sitting there going, I'm looking at Jeanette Finicum, I'm like, she's not gonna storm a cockpit and fly it into a building. You just don't see it. Matter of fact, I've met with her entire family. 12 kids, 31 grandkids, 26 with 5 on the way. That's a lot of people. And you know what? In all of the conversations I spent with the Finicum family, I never once heard that they were going to strap a suicide vest and go run into the building like this and shoot nails at everybody. Matter of fact, you know what? There's a love for all of you, regardless of your narrative. I can't believe how gracious this family is. I can't believe how much they appreciate the FBI, Oregon State Police, Harney County Sheriff's Department. The forgiveness in their heart for the way they were labeled by the media and how the domestic homeland security threat lexicon or threat assessment, which was falsified, and we found out in the Nevada trials, but of course, was that reported on? No. Lavoy Finicum was what position on that threat assessment? Number 1. It's amazing to me. It blows my mind. Wikipedia won't allow her or her family to change the Wikipedia article to the facts as they are found in the recent trial, the FBI agent who was accused of obstructing justice and lying about shooting. They won't allow the family to put the truth out. When's that going to change? And so this documentary that you're about to see is just an introduction to Lavoy Finicum. It's episode 1 of 3 episodes. You're going to get to actually hear from his own mouth, his own words, what he said. And can we have a civil dialogue about whether we agree or disagree? Rather than putting in your articles how he's a domestic extremist on the verge of committing an act of domestic terrorism and needed to be shot. Thank God. Seriously? Anyway, he never got his day in court. Everyone else that were in the vehicles that day, except for Ryan Payne, all of them were acquitted by a jury of their peers. Lavoy never got his day in court. So we kind of see that as this. This is your opportunity, jury, including the media, including anyone who's here who's not for this stuff. We hope that you will learn something about Lavoy Finicum, and maybe we could sit down at the table together and have a civil discourse about public lands, our native lands. You know, there's a really interesting story just before I get started, because I really hope that the media will write this down. Did you know that the native Germans in their native Germany worked very hard to get rid of the non-native Jews? So we have to be careful with our dialogue when we say public lands or native lands, and then we use labels to lynch people out of existence who are non-native. You know, they used a movie called The Eternal Jew in which they labeled Jews as rats, contagious, disease-carrying rats. You know, I can't believe some of the things I've heard called of Lavoy Finicum and Jeanette Finicum worse than rats. Scum, disease-carrying, worthy of death, all this stuff. It's very similar to the language we heard back in the 1930s from the native Germans regarding the non-native Jews. I really think it's time for our country, especially the media, right, and for the rest of us, to learn how to communicate in a civil discourse. Not just putting our political bias behind our articles so that we can label people's reputations, businesses, get them imprisoned, or dead. Lavoy Finicum is not what you think. He wasn't a domestic extremist. He wasn't a domestic terrorist. He wasn't going to strap a suicide bomb to his vest. You guys won't believe, you won't believe the facts that come out in the case against the FBI agent. You know, Mr. Finicum was in compliance at the first stop, under the command of an FBI agent. Then someone from the Oregon State Police Office shot at the vehicle, and that's when things escalated. But did you hear that in the media? No, Mr. Finicum was fleeing law enforcement, right? You also hear that the officers were afraid for their lives, but actually, according to forensic scientists testifying in a federal court, Mr. Finicum was braking before he came to the dead man curve, where his vehicle was shot at 3 times. Then as he got out of his vehicle, he was shot at twice with his hands in the air before he was shot in the back. Did you hear any of that in the media? Can you show of hands? Anybody? Was that reported? No, nobody. Yeah, it's not. No, it's not reported at all. What is reported is the domestic extremist was on his way to commit an act of domestic terrorism. And what do you do with terrorists? You kill them or put them in prison, right? We have a serious problem in our country, and I really hope that you will see from today's episode 1 that you yourselves will get to know Lavoy Finicum. I spoke at his 6-month memorial in July 26, it seems like it's forever ago, 2016. And I started saying the following things. I love the federal government. We need the federal government. I'm not anarchist. I'm not anti-government. And people in that room actually started booing me. One guy stormed out of there. People were rolling their eyes. And I realized at that exact moment, as I watched Jeanette and her oldest daughter weeping at that memorial they put on, those were Lavoy Finicum's words. So on one side of our country, they got their martyr. On the other side of the country, they got their dead terrorists. But what about the majority of the American people? What about the civil dialogue regarding the stability of our country? What about the rights of the Native Indians and how they've been violated? What about the African Americans and how their rights have been violated? What about the property owners around this country and their rights have been violated? What about the Hammonds? What about them? What about all of them? Why is it so one-sided? Maybe that's a discussion we could have. I'm willing to have it. Why is it so one-sided? All right, I've said too much. 67 minutes. Episode 2 is already done. It's going to be coming out. I hope you'll do a couple things. Would you consider having Jeanette back to watch episode 2? Would you consider